to this point that it's not time to celebrate. Problem number one, Joseph is no longer in the promised land. God made a promise to Abraham. He renewed that promise with Isaac, and he renewed that promise with Jacob, that he would make them a great nation and that they would have a great land. Joseph has been cast out of the promised land. That's a problem. Secondly, Joseph is separated from his family and from the covenant people. And now thirdly, he finds himself in a pagan land under a pagan king, and he is given something that is incredibly dangerous, and that is power. Lord Acton was right when he said power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So here's Joseph, away from his family, away from the covenant community, away from the land of promise, in a pagan land with power. This is not the time to celebrate. Not only does he have power, but we see that he also has great wealth. Pharaoh gives him great wealth. What does the scripture say about wealth? It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into heaven. So now he has power, he has wealth, he's away from his family, away from the covenant people, away from the land of promise. And he has two of the things that are hardest for anyone to deal with if your desire is to serve God. Let me put a pencil here. Because frankly, for many of you, Joseph is right now in the place that you desire to be when you graduate. You don't care about your family. You don't care about the covenant community. What you care about is being wealthy and being powerful. How do I know this? Because I've sat where you sit. I came to Houston Baptist University as a transfer student. I transferred my senior year. By the way, not a good idea. I'm just saying. I was a student at Rice University. I was on the football team there. I was majoring in international business and pre-law. Now, if you'd asked me what I wanted to do, my response would have been, I want to be an international lawyer. If you knew me well and I gave you the honest answer, I would have said to you, my goal is to be the most powerful black man in America. I usually kept that one to myself. But that's what I wanted. Position, power, status, wealth. Until God got a hold of me. And what I wanted was to serve my king. And as a result, I went from a place where I used to sign my name every semester to take care of whatever the bills were. I couldn't tell you how much it cost for me to go to school over there because it was free. I just signed my name. And I came over here with a wife and a daughter. And they said, you owe us this. To which I responded, well, okay, but what, where do I sign for that? They said, what, you can sign a check? I said, no, see, what had happened was at the other place, I have to pay? Something interesting happened. God crushed my pride. He absolutely crushed my pride in this place. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me outside of getting saved and getting married. So here's Joseph. Outside of the covenant community, outside of the promised land, away from his family, with wealth and power beyond anything he ever could have imagined. Could things get worse? Yeah, they do. The next part of the text says this, verse 44, moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no one shall lift up a hand or a foot in the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphanath-Paneah. He gives him an Egyptian name. And he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Can it get worse? Yeah, it can get worse. Outside of the covenant community, away from his family, outside of the land of promise, he has wealth, he has power, and now he's got a wife who he's forced to marry, basically, who is the daughter of a pagan priest. It just got worse. Again, usually this is the time when we celebrate. Usually this is the time in Joseph's life when we go, yes, see, God has vindicated him. This is the payoff point. So if you trust God, now let me put this together for you. Here's what we usually say. If you trust God, you too can have all of this. Really? Outside of the covenant community, outside of the land of promise, away from my family, with wealth in a pagan land, power in a pagan land, and forced to enter into a marriage that God, throughout the scriptures, says is forbidden. That cannot be the payoff. There has to be something more. Well, there is. Here's what's interesting. Let me give you a couple of things. One, let me assure you that hope is not lost. But secondly, let me give you an overview of what this is really all about. One, we know that all hope is not lost because later on in the story we read this, and God gives us a little glimpse. Look with me, if you will, over in verse 50. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of his firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. Verse 52, the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. There's hope right there. And you hear that and you go, wait a minute, why is there hope right there? I'm glad you asked. Here's why there's hope. He gave his boys Hebrew names, which says he has not forgotten who he is. Pharaoh gave him an Egyptian name, and he lived in accordance with that Egyptian name because Pharaoh commanded that he be given that Egyptian name. But when his sons were born, he points back to the covenant community and he names his sons in such a way that he says, I remember who I am and whose I am. Secondly, the names of his sons. One means I have forgotten my afflictions. In other words, he is not saying I'm holding on to what was done to me and I'm defining myself by what was done to me. He says I let that go. The second son's name means God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. In other words, he does not consider Egypt his home. He doesn't look back and say, back there with my brothers, that was the land of my affliction. No, he looks at Egypt and he says, Egypt is the land of my affliction. The land where I'm wealthy and powerful and respected. The land where I'm the right-hand man to the most powerful man on the planet. This is the land of my affliction. Why? Because he lives for and hopes for and yearns for the promised land. That's what it looks like when you don't live for yourself. If you want to get this, here's what you have to understand. In the moments that I have remaining, let me explain to you why this cannot be the apex of the story. In Genesis chapter 1, we see the creation of the world. In Genesis chapter 2, we get a microcosm look and we see the creation of man and woman. We see the creation of the first family. In Genesis chapter 1, we have got this command that comes out in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 28, that you'll be fruitful and multiply, and that you go and exercise dominion over all the earth. Genesis chapter 2, we see the picture of this marriage, this family that is going to usher that in. But in Genesis chapter 3, things go very bad. In Genesis chapter 3, we meet the serpent. In Genesis chapter 3, we see the fall of man and the introduction of sin and death. But again, in Genesis chapter 3, not all hope is lost. Because in Genesis chapter 3, there is the curse for the man, the curse for the woman, and ultimately the curse for the serpent. Now, when the curse is given to the serpent, we need to pay attention. Because God says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. You will bruise his heel, but he will crush your head. In other words, in that moment, God tells us what the rest of the Bible is all about. It is a story of redemption and the promised seed. And everything that we look at in scriptures and in your life and in mine needs to be viewed through that picture of redemption if we're going to live for God and not ourselves. Does the serpent take this seriously? Yes, he does. Because in chapter 4, we have the first murder. Cain, seed of the serpent, according to 1 John chapter 2, kills Abel, seed of the woman. But that's okay. The promise is still alive. In chapter 5, we see Seth, who was born in the image of his father Adam, the promised seed. In chapter 5, we see 10 generations from Seth down to Noah. What's that about? That is reminding you that God will keep his promise and there will be a promised seed. Eventually, there is the flood, but Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth make it through the flood with their wives. Things start all over again after the flood, and eventually we're introduced to a man by the name of Abraham. Abraham is given a promise, and God makes a covenant with him in Genesis chapter 12. That promise has to do with children, the promised seed. Abraham takes things into his own hand, but he goes off with Hagar, who, by the way, was an Egyptian, and has a son by the name of Ishmael. Ishmael's not the promised seed. Isaac, however, who is born later, is the promised seed. Isaac has two sons, twins, named Jacob and Esau. Esau was the firstborn, but he was not the promised seed. Jacob was the promised seed. Jacob goes off and he gets married. Now, there's a little problem when Jacob gets married. He goes and he finds a girl by the name of Rachel, and when he sees her, he decides that she is the one. He loves this girl. He wants this girl. And he tells her father. Laban says, give me 7 years of labor and I'll give her to you. 7 years later, he gets married, and it's all good, right? Not so much. You see, this girl had a sister. It is said of her, the one that Jacob loved, that she was lovely in appearance. Her sister Leah, however, had eyes that were weak. That's the Bible's very kind way of saying, she had a nice personality. Jacob wakes up after the wedding night, and it's Leah. He's been tricked. See, we think this is a love story, but remember, I told you it's not. This is about the promised seed. Eventually, Laban gives him Rachel as well. So he's got a wife that he loves and a wife that he doesn't even want. The one that he loves can't have children. The one that he doesn't even want starts having kids. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, the father of the priesthood, and Judah. Judah would eventually be the father of a man by the name of David, who is a descendant of Judah. David is a very important man because he is a king in Israel who gets another covenant in 2 Samuel chapter 7, that he will have a son who will reign forever on his throne. Now, eventually, if you follow the seed, you get to the seed of David, who is the God-man, Jesus Christ. So when you open the New Testament, the first thing you see in the book of Matthew is what? Something that we want to look over and get to the good stuff, a genealogy. Why do you start with a genealogy in Matthew? Oh, you guys ask all the right questions. You start with a genealogy in Matthew because God is screaming. Do you remember the promise I made in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15?